out there, and welcome back to My Grocery Adventure, a podcast for people who want to make an impact. And we are rejoined for Dan Nagengast's fifth episode. We have four other episodes of hearing about all of the ways that, just what I would even call just like a regular life, a farm kid, growing up in rural Nebraska, how truly any path can lead us into making an impact in so many different ways when we just continue to show up, continue to go on to the next thing. And the first four episodes laid out a really impactful path so far. And what would you say when you came back from Africa? Were you about 30 the last time you were kind of
30,
done over there?
32 maybe. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, we've got, you did a lot with your 20s. You became worldly as you wanted to be. And then you transitioned back to the States. And I wonder what was the biggest like culture shock of like having lived abroad and then coming back? Do you remember any like, wow, this is like not the same place that it was before? Do you remember any
Uh,
sensations?
well, grocery stores were mind-boggling. I mean, when there was no such thing and all food was, pretty much handed to you in the market and you took it home or you grew it yourself. That was
Yeah.
one. I had a chance two chances to escort Africans around the U.S. during those 8 years I was there,
Mm.
for 2, 3 weeks at a time. And it was the same thing for them. They couldn't believe supermarkets and they couldn't believe the pet food aisle in supermarkets. It was sort of like you pay money to feed your pets, it was, and not only that, and it's much worse now. I mean, now we have insurance and,
All kinds
uh,
of things. Yeah.
yeah, cancer treatment for pets and all that stuff just was mind-boggling to me. And just the ease and comfort, I suppose. And also maybe the unwillingness to appreciate all that. It was sort of taken for granted, an assumption that it will always be there, or there'll be more of it
Hmm.
eventually, and which
Hmm.
is true. I mean, I don't get me wrong. I underestimate the ability of humans to pad their nests every
Make it
day.
even nicer. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just keeps going. But I still, I think the appreciation for it ended a long time ago, and it became a need instead of you know, a little dispensation that Earth granted you because you were born in this spot,
Mm.
and now it's like I deserve this, that's
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
So,
Well, and think about like just even that one little piece of our perspective of
hmm
like, is this world that we live in, no matter where you live, is it a gift or is
hmm
it something that belongs to you?
hmm
You know,
yeah.
like why do we get to experience such pleasure like the sunrise I saw this morning?
hmm
Oh my God, like what did I do to earn that? What did I do to deserve that? Nothing.
hmm
Nothing. I just got to experience it because it's a gift. It's a gift of this world, one of the many that we get to live with. So, I mean, I do just want to drop in here that there are places, there are circles, there are communities that I get to be a part of where like appreciation is the default. But like for the people in those spaces, like it's the default because you practice that
hmm
being the default, you
hmm
know? And to your point, there's a lot of people who are kind of like just riding the default mode of
hmm
like, you know, entitlement maybe, or like assuming that it'll always be there or whatever, as opposed to really taking the time to like savor the appreciation of like truly what you have access to. Like right here,
Yes.
right now, like hot water in your shower.
Yeah.
Talk about like a miracle. Like
Yeah.
every day there are miracles. And yeah.
Well, it's seductive too, and I think anybody from any culture can be seduced by it. I mean, you
What do you
can
mean by that? Say more about like,
you can be. Well, I have a friend who he was the 22nd generation born in a room in Alexandria, uh, Egypt. So came from a long line of people. He's now a professor emeritus of economics at KU, And, I mean, I'm not picking him out particularly, but he came from a background totally different from mine, and he's wallowing in it just as I am. We and anybody from any culture will wallow in this stuff, in this material,
Hmm.
padded material
Hmm.
that we live in.
Like
And
it's
it's
human. It's not
yeah.
a,
Oh yeah, it's
yeah.
really true. Yeah, I mean, some, I think the way I've seen it best deal with is when cultures remain intact, as to families and stuff like that. I have some Native American friends, and they're, you know, by all weights and measures, they should have been. I mean, there shouldn't be any more of them, and they're still here. And that's what they'll say. They're still here, and they have very tight family connections, and call each other uncle and all that kind of stuff, and it extends to anybody in there, and it's, I mean, they also wallow in American culture too, but that part of them stays the same, and it reinforces their, I would call them religious or spiritual beliefs and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
So there's ways to combat material culture, and material culture is not just American culture. It's
No.
Chinese culture, and it's Singaporean culture, and it's everywhere else. It's
Yeah.
so. But I think we were getting kind of far away from
The
ever
culture
finishing.
shock was where we started with, like, the
Yeah.
do you appreciate the level of ease and comfort that you have? And I think to your point that that's something that no matter where you live, no matter kind of what background you're from, like it takes just a little bit of effort to stay in appreciation to make sure that you're focused there. But yes, so when you came back
Mhm.
from Africa and now you're back in the States, where did you land? Like, where did you plant yourself
Well,
first?
I decided I needed to come back because my parents were getting elderly, and so I looked at the map, and I was working for Church World Service in Senegal, and they had a position opened up as a fundraiser and a person who worked with farmers to get grain donations for famine relief in Kansas. And I thought, well, that's just next door, and it's only a 13-hour drive. I mean, it was like halfway across the country from eastern Nebraska to west or eastern
Oh,
Kansas, and
wow.
but I did that, and so I came back, and first thing I did, the job was in Topeka, Kansas, which I never, I would never have chosen that place, but there I was, and I bought a farm almost immediately, or got a mortgage for a pretty. It wasn't an abandoned farm, but it was, I got 25 acres 30 minutes outside of Topeka with barns and a livable house for $40,000. This was in
Oh,
1984 or 85, something like that. And it had a new kitchen and a new bathroom on it and stuff like that. And so it was a nice, pretty little farm. So I bought that. And first thing I did, it had a pond, and it had a spillway over that. And I built some rice paddies, and I grew paddy rice for
just couldn't
3
leave it behind.
Yeah, for 3 years, I was growing paddy rice.
Oh,
There's
wow.
I have a story about that. I think it's called "The History of Paddy Rice in Kansas," I think it's called.
We'll
So
link
that's
that one in the
yeah, yeah.
description. Yeah.
So I was living there, traveling all, every little town in Kansas and all that kind of stuff, and um, they asked me that the famine in 1984 or 85 came about in Ethiopia. And there was a group in Kansas City, and started by the Mayor Berkeley at the time, and a bunch of sort of, churches and all that kind of thing. And they wanted to raise money for the Ethiopian famine, and they approached Church World Service, and Church World Service said yes if they would also visit the project that I had been on in Senegal to see how that worked instead of just straight up famine relief, which was how do we get food to people. And so I took a group of Kansas Cityans to Senegal, and then we flew across Africa and went to Ethiopia. And it's the only time I was ever sad in Africa, about the plight of Africans, was in Ethiopia. And there's a Substack story about that too. And let's go into great detail about that. But one of the people who was part of the committee in Kansas City was my future wife, who I didn't know whether she was going to be my future wife, but she's a reporter for, her name's Lynn Bazinski, and she's a reporter was a reporter for the Kansas City Star, doing she was their school desegregation reporter. And she volunteered for that group to do their publicity for them too. And so I got to know her that way. And she got to see the farm and all that kind of stuff. And so did all that, came back, working at Church World Service. And of course we got married, and she got pregnant. And this would have been 1988 or 89. And we both had professional jobs, and neither of us wanted to be away from the farm all day when we had a baby. So we both quit our jobs, and we lived in abject poverty. 1 year, I think we were there for 2 years until we started. We had our son, and then we started. She started a magazine, so she could work from home. But she also started working part-time as adjunct at KU, and we decided we would become vegetable farmers also. So we were going to try to turn the farm into something. And I know that 1 year, the biggest chunk of income we had was her car got hailed on and was totaled, and we could still drive the car. So we made $9,000, just, fell from heaven, there you go. And we started farming, got pretty serious about that, not understanding the scales that would be needed to make an income. But, we were making something anyway.
Learned a lot, I'm sure.
Also. Yeah. Well, and nobody knew anything. And so that's why she started the magazine. It's called Growing for Market, and still is in publication today. We sold it, I think, 6 years ago to a guy who was one of her writers from Maine, and it's still going strong. You can look that up, Growing for Market. It's on.
We'll put a link to that too. Yeah.
Yeah. And she would write books also about it. So every day when we were farming, we go, well, how do you do this? And that was, well, let's write the story. It became, how do you do it? All this stuff. It was just, anything you can think of, nobody had written about it, or had been written about in 1865. But, tools, I don't know, varieties, marketing, wash sheds, how do you get rid of weeds? And we were always interested in organic and sustainable practices, cover crops, none of that. There was nothing out there.
Yeah.
Universities weren't interested. I mean, there were individuals in universities interested, and that's who you did. You'd find those guys, and they would, somebody had been studying it for a few years, knew a few other places to go look for information. But basically, she was talking to farmers around the country, and to the probably at the time 6, 7 extension people in the country interested in organic vegetable production or cut flower production. And she got really interested in cut flowers, and so the magazine became part cut flowers, part vegetable growing, but all market farming and that sort of thing. So that kind of kept us afloat for a while, and she was teaching, and then I was approached. I got to know the people at the Kansas Rural Center, which is a nonprofit, and they seemed to think I was underemployed, because they kept saying, "You need to be our director," and I go, "I don't need to be your director." But finally, I said, "I'll be your director for part-time." So I started doing that part-time, and we had 5 or 6 staff. And part of my story is I'm incredibly lucky, and probably within days after I became the director, one of the staff, a person named Jerry Jost, landed a $900,000, almost $1 million grant from the Kellogg Foundation. And so I was like, slid right in there. I'm suddenly the director.
I'm the director
of a $60,000 a year nonprofit, to the director of at least 4 years of 250.
You said within days. It was
very, very close. Yeah, I was like, the first public meeting I had was it was an annual kind of 10th year anniversary celebration or something like that. And I got to announce we just landed that grant. It was like, it was.
Wow.
So
First order of business.
I'm a
Yeah.
lucky person. It's just that kind of thing has happened to me.
Can
Or,
I ask you a quick question about why, like, what was your resistance to I don't want to be your director? Like, why not? Like, what was your
well,
pushing it?
I was enjoying farming and being home and with the baby and all that kind of stuff. But we did need money. I mean, there was no getting around it. And it was,
Tough one.
in my wheelhouse. It was stuff that I had been doing for a long time. But they approached me. I didn't approach them, and they kind of wooed me. They would come out and that kind of stuff. So the person who did that was a woman named Sarah Dean, and she just died this year. And
Mm.
she's another remarkable person that did stuff for the state of Kansas that the state of Kansas will never know.
Yeah.
Um,
One of the greats.
so anyway, so that happened. So I started, instead of driving around the state trying to raise money for overseas relief, I'm trying to continuing to have to raise money for uh, sustainable agriculture. And if you get to know the nonprofit world in agriculture in Kansas, you have this whole raft of production-oriented nonprofits that are basically lobbyists for the corn industry, for the cattle industry, you know, for big agriculture. And then sustainable agriculture, there's no money out there. There's no funding. There's no anything. So you've got Farmers Union, which is sort of the offset to Kansas Farm Bureau. Kansas Farm Bureau was started by the National Association of Manufacturers because they thought agriculture was going left back in the 1890s. And Farmers Union was a farmers union trying to make sure that the proceeds from agriculture stayed with family farms and rural communities. So they've been battling for 100 and some years, and which one is best funded, of course, of course, and so that was and then the rural center was this little pipsqueak piping up saying, well, what about sustainability? And I remember going to a I don't know, Senate hearing or something, and what was that? The K State said there is no such word as sustainability, and would not use it in any of their any public thing. And we kept saying, but what about sustainability? And they go, there's no such word. And so I remember in 92 or 93, we had as one of our goals was to get the Kansas State University to use the word sustainability in a public document.
That was your goal.
That was one of our goals.
Yeah.
It was kind of a tongue-in-cheek goal, but it was a goal.
Yeah.
And probably 3 years later, they used the word sustainment, and everybody goes, sustainment, is that a word? I don't think that's a word. I've never heard of it. But we're
We're inching closer.
like they put their nose under the tent, as they say. And then we used to hold a sustainability conference at K-State every year at the off campus, well, sometimes on campus, and we'd invite the dean, and we had a series of running battles with deans until eventually we got one that was sort of embarrassed by their stance, and started working with us, and started appointing people who would be work on organic issues and on grazing systems and stuff like that. And little by little, and your goal is always to get this institutionalized, get it out of our crazy, powerless hands and into, $100 million organization that it becomes part of their agenda. And of course, they're going to skew it. It'll not go exactly the way you want.
Right. They'll own it then.
Yeah,
They can
yeah.
do what they want with it, but at least they're doing something.
And now they do quite a bit. I mean,
Wow.
and it's probably on a per county basis. But there'd be extension agents who were like, "Yes, I've always wanted to do that." And there were researchers who would. You mean I'll have my back padded if I research this instead of, how best to kill weeds with chemicals. And little by little that has changed. That's not to say it took over the university, but at least it's accepted. in the university, and there are people writing theses on issues and getting positions because they become the expert in something. And that's true of county extension agents too. There were 2 or 3 that really were interested in local food production, and so they started gathering attention from others out there who were also getting those requests, but had always just pushed it aside because yeah, it's just another crazy person who wants to grow stuff without chemicals. I don't know what's wrong with them, but
Mm.
so all that stuff has been mainstream. There's now a local food production group at K-State. I mean, I think it's a major, urban agriculture and stuff like that. I mean,
I wrote my master's thesis on, are consumers willing to pay for sustainably produced food products?
there you go. Yeah,
Organic, local, small farm. Like I studied that, and
yeah.
that was like funded by the USDA, though my fellowship was. It didn't come through the College of Ag, but
Oh,
still,
no.
I was at K-State doing this. And
Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
Well, and one of our other tactics was to say other places are doing this. Why doesn't K-State do this? I mean, we tried to get probably 90, 91. We tried a lot of states were starting organic agriculture programs where they were certifying, state certified. Colorado had one, all that kind of stuff. So we tried to do that in Kansas, and K-State researchers came to another House or Senate hearing and said, there is no such thing as organic agriculture. Organic can only be used as in the word of, as organic chemistry in that sense. And we're going, well, you got 26 states who have organic agriculture. How can you ignore that as a researcher? I mean, you have to talk about building a wall. It's like, no, they're not there. We don't
right.
see
Like,
nothing else there. It was just like, and it was like K-State professors were invited, and that's what they said. It's sort of like saying you can't use the word blues when you're talking about music. Music's not a color. I mean, it was that kind of,
it's
that
like
was,
such the epitome of like the past versus the future, which is
yeah,
like just this battle that's like constantly going on.
yeah, yeah.
And I love that like these things, like organic farming just being one example, but like really anything, these things don't just become mainstream.
Mhm,
Like like your work and lots of other people pushed it into the mainstream because you thought it should be there.
mhm.
Like you pushed it with your own work, your own effort, your own attention. Like you made it happen. I mean,
Well,
the
there's a whole,
collective you.
there was a whole other thing going on, and then there was a lot of people that were interested in this kind of agriculture were women, and so there was a whole. I mean, I have a friend, Mary Hendrickson, who was a rural sociologist, and she was teaching about sustainability, and her class would have 27 women and 1 man. I mean, there are a lot of women farmers, solely owned farms that are doing organics or goats or cheese or local food systems. I mean, that's not to say there aren't men doing that either. But if you looked at, um, grain producers and feedlots and stuff like that, and that's not to say that women on those farms don't work. I mean, but it's a real male-oriented, equipment-oriented, chemical-oriented, size-oriented, competition.
Profit oriented.
Yeah, yeah, all that kind of stuff is
Yeah.
there, and that's not
Yeah.
to say that those people are bad or anything like that.
Just a
But
different way.
there were there was a whole other population that was interested in agriculture, but not that way.
Right.
They were interested in agriculture in a hands-on, a community building sort of thing. So that was going on at the same time, and the if you go to a ag session at the state house, there would be women lobbyists, and they were always beautiful. And they'd go up to legislators and they'd be pulling their ties. I mean, you were seeing that. I mean, I witnessed that, that sort of thing. Then there's some guy in the background, sort of, so that they used. There was a use of women as the face of things, but it's a bunch of guys with cigars who want to
Mm.
sell tractors in the background. I mean, that was going on. So that's
Right.
my opinion anyway.
Yeah.
That's not to say those women were bad or anything, but
I
they
feel
had,
like that's probably going on in most advertising. It's like
well,
you put a
yeah.
beautiful woman on the front of it if you want to sell some of this, you know?
I remember a long time, um, a person who's been sort of the pillar of the rural centers, a woman named Mary Fund. And, you'd see her, and sometimes there'd be these women lobbyists from the pork producers and places like that. And Mary Fund would be sitting there, and they'd all be in glamour, I mean, they were, and Mary's there in her sweater, and she smells like patchouli, and it was like, there's another way to be a woman too,
She's authentic. Yeah,
all
she's
kinds of ways.
doing her thing.
So anyway,
Wow, that's
and then the other thing I had to do was to fund myself, because
say
that
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 again. That you
I
did
had
what?
money to pay my salary. I mean, I was continually, and that 200, that Kellogg grant allowed us a lot of outreach, and a lot of them went to groups of small groups of study groups of farmers
Mm,
who were trying to explore something. And I
mhm.
ran one of those groups, or started one of those groups. It was the Rolling Prairie Farmers Alliance, which was a cooperative market farm group that started the first cooperative CSA in the country. And
Yeah.
that's Rolling Prairie, and it's still going. I'm not in it anymore because I don't farm anymore, but it's approaching 30 years old now, and
How many
still.
members do you know?
Well, there's the numbers of farmers varies from, it's probably 7, 8, 9, 10, that kind of thing, and the numbers of vendors is probably 300, 350, and they all have other outlets for the food they grow. I mean, most of them do, but it's been here and in Kansas City for years and years. So that was one of the first. My wife and I had the first, I think, CSA on that Auburn farm south of Topeka, and that was all um, psychiatrists at Meningers, and just it was this crowd of ethereal people floating above Topeka, and plus friends. We decided to go when our son was born. We decided to go to the Mennonite church just to give him cred, because the Gulf War was starting, and he was a baby, but we didn't want him to be drafted down the road, and so we thought, well, here's a way to start building a resume for him that could allow him to avoid the draft, because I grew up
Like
home
you got to avoid the draft by being in
in
school.
school.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And
Wow.
now there really isn't a draft anymore, because
Yeah, I couldn't even like I don't have kids yet, but like that just never would have even crossed my mind of like make sure you make them a path that they can like get out. I mean,
yeah,
that's
that
fascinating.
was in our mind. So there were people at that church who were really, I mean, I mean, we chose that church because it was very progressive and all that kind of stuff, and they were interested in local food and organics and all that kind of stuff. So we had at CSA maybe 100 people for several years, and then the Rolling Prairie CSA also. So I was doing that. I got some Pew money to write a manual on how to market farm, and then I got some money from somewhere to write a manual on how to form a cooperative CSA, or how to do a CSA and all that kind of stuff. And little by little, I would write grants that would allow me to do stuff that I wanted, and they paid me to be the they weren't paying me to be the director of the rural center, but I was the director of the rural center, and I was getting paid, but it was from doing another project. So I was doing projects directly in the rural center, and also farming at the same time. And also Lynn was farming at the same time, and writing. She wrote several books, which have done really well. And she also did her monthly newsletter. So we had like lots of irons, and plus we were raising our kids at home. So we had lots of irons in
How
this.
old are your kids? Like how far apart are they? And how many do you have?
They're 4 years apart, and one is 30. Well, would he be
Did you say
30?
89? 90?
Yeah, he's 35 this year, and our daughter's 30 or 31.
Okay.
And our son runs the seed business that we bought in 2011. And our daughter works for the Explore Lawrence, which is the Convention Visitors Bureau for downtown Lawrence, sort of thing. She's their digital person. So they're still here, you know, and so we have our families all still within 10 minutes of each other, which is kind of nice. So anyway, I would write grants for things like we started a cooperative tomato processing group. I wrote a grant to do a grass-fed beef cooperative down the Flint Hills. We got to know a bunch of really, progressive ranchers down there. No, neither of those are still running. I mean, because nobody had ever tried either one of those things, and we found out this, it was really scale is the issue. It's a lot harder to do and enter into a marketplace. I remember at one point the ranchers cooperative, they were selling this grass-fed beef, and at one point a guy went into the Brooklyn, New York food co-op and saw their beef there, and it was like $17 a pound. It was a frozen chunk of beef that had been in their freezer for 3 years or something like that. He's like, they had to sell it that way to find markets, but it was like, this is not going to work, and it burned them out. And a woman named Nanny Wilson, who's a rancher and was very involved in it down there, wrote a really good description of the whole process they went through, and critiqued why 10 guys and 10 people in the Flint Hills aren't going to have a grass-fed cooperative, that they take it from the grass to the store. It's just, there's a whole lot of scale issues. And I wrote the tomato cooperative grant, not that I wanted to can tomatoes, but I wanted it to offer seasonal jobs to farm families. If they wanted to can tomatoes, go in once every 2-3 weeks, spend a day and an evening there, get paid in tomatoes, processed tomatoes that you can take to farmers markets or sell to the co-op, or sell online or whatever. So that was so you have input cooperatives, let's buy all our seed potatoes together. You have out marketing cooperatives, let's sell it all together. And this was a processing cooperative, which was another weird idea that I'd come up with. And what I learned was that I was the one going to be doing the majority of the canning. I mean, there were 2 or 3 people that really bought into that and wanted to sell, but by and large, most people just wanted to offload it. And there's some other interesting cooperatives out there, or not even cooperatives, but standalone businesses. I know there was one called the Main Street Dairy in Minnesota, and you could bring your milk in. They would bottle your milk, batch process your milk, turn it into kefir or chocolate milk, anything you wanted with your own label. Then you took it back and sold it, and you could sell it to your local co-op, and it could be in your store. And it was all, processed by the book and labeled and licensed stuff, but you could get the retail price for it.
Yeah.
And that pretty much worked, because you had a guy who just wanted to run a dairy, and he didn't. And so he would just, people would just bring their milk in, or their cheese or whatever, or, whatever they had, they wanted to turn into a dairy product, and that worked. So the co-op idea just, probably it was a scale issue. If we would have had enough scale that we could have a person marketing and those sorts of things, it might have worked. The whole idea that farmers also wanted these little seasonal off-farm jobs,
that wasn't really true.
That's they didn't want anywhere here. I mean, they did, but it just, that was the flaw in that whole thing. And the salsa was great. The salsa sold well. The salsa. Here's what killed the salsa, and it's another scale issue. But we were using Central Soy Foods, which is a soy food factory here in Lawrence, and when they were making soy food, we'd rent their place. It was a processing kitchen, so a certified kitchen, and they had 150 gallon steam jacketed kettles. I mean, these, you know, those sorts of things. So one day we have that full, which means we've been cutting up hundreds of pounds of tomatoes and peppers and peeling garlic. And
Hours.
yeah. We get it full. It's cooking away. And a woman named Joan, who was one of the farmers, looks down and she had a wedding ring that had 4 or 5 stones in it, like malachite and, you know, red stuff. I mean, they were salsa colored stones. And she looked down and all the stones were gone out of her ring. They were in 150 gallons of salsa. We couldn't sell. I mean, it was like a couple of weeks worth of, you know.
Doesn't that just feel like a punch in the stomach?
Oh God, you know,
Like,
and so we went ahead and canned up the salsa and gave it to friends, saying, "There's some
be
stones,
warned.
so don't chew your salsa, just swallow it," you know, that sort of thing. But we couldn't
You'll be
sell it.
fine.
Yeah, and that was the, you know, that was this, you know, you learn don't wear jewelry when you're doing food processing. I mean, you know, there
Wow.
was just like things that any big company.
They already know that stuff.
Yeah, we didn't know that stuff.
That's the problem with the scale is that, you know, you learn through a lot of mistakes. And that's no problem, you know,
Yeah.
like it's no shade that you make mistakes, but it's expensive to
Hmm.
make mistakes. Like that one batch, that was 2 weeks worth of effort. Like that's expensive, you know? And that's where absorbing those kinds of mistakes on that little of a scale, yeah, it can kill your
Well,
future real
it was
quick.
it was demoralizing too. You know, it was like,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah,
it's
deflating. Absolutely. I can
you know.
feel that.
So I mean, I was working my butt off. Lynn was working. Everybody was working their butt off, but just like to what end, you know? And so we quit doing that.
Well, and
Uh,
can I ask like a practical question? Because I love that this is airing when it is that we did your first part of your story at the end of last year, and then we're coming back here. In between, we heard from Kathy Drager, and she told a story that basically sounds exactly like yours as far as like her work and her salary is coming from like finding this next project and getting it funded and finding this next project and getting it funded. And she's been doing that for like decades or whatever. And so my question is like when you write a grant, like this is what you're going to live on, right? Like it has to have your salary in it and like money for, right? Like there's money for other stuff. Like what goes through your mind when you decide like what's the salary component that you need to factor into that grant? Like how do
oh,
you, yeah.
for us, it was always, what can we get away with? I mean, and there was no one, none of these grants was ever going to fund me to be director of the Kansas Rural Center. It could fund some of my time at the Kansas Rural Center. I always fought having to keep track of in 15-minute increments of how I spent my day because
Mm.
I'd have to lie, you know. I mean, I clearly was spending more than 40 hours a week on rural center stuff, but some of it was basically not funded by grants. And so if you start having to particular, and I think a lot of foundations have come to that understanding that I mean, grant funding is changed and it hasn't changed, but for a long time it's like pitch us your newest idea and we'll fund it for a year to get it off the ground, and then you're on your own. Well, all the new ideas were pitched, and then bad ideas starting to get, you know, how can we
Hmm.
reshape this so it looks like a new idea to you, or you will accept it as a
Mm.
new idea, but we're basically going to be doing the same thing. I mean, that, you know, and how do you fund lobbying? You can't fund lobbying or any of that kind of stuff with it, you know. So I never had a lobbying badge, but I went down to the legislature a lot, you know, and would just testify on things, but never as the, you know, I'd say I worked with the Kansas Rural Center, but I wasn't never the Kansas Rural Center law. I think I had a lobbying badge once or twice, but so some of those things, issues that were going on, there was early on, they were trying to throw out the corporate farming law, which was from, I don't know, 1920s or 30s, that said it was illegal for corporations to own farmland or, that sort of thing. And those were around those were battles that were fought between Farmers Union and Farm Bureau, 120 years ago. And states basically came out on down the populist side that corporations shouldn't be owning all this. Well, I don't know if you realize this, but corporations want to influence everything, and they'll use the argument that we're just trying to protect markets while they're solidifying their market. I mean, you see monopolies saying, "Oh, we're a monopoly," and you say, "Well, let's do something about you need to help us because we're the telephone monopoly." And you say, "Okay, let's start a lot of other." Oh no, we can't have a lot of other ways to deliver telephone services, and it's true of energy and it's true of agriculture. They're basically anti-market, while
That's not a market. If you have one,
waving the flag of markets, because the bigger they get, the less they want to see anybody out there doing anything like that. So you've got these big cultural battles going on, and you'll have warriors will stand up for a year or two, and then then they're going to have a baby, so they quit their jobs, and on the other side, you have so much income being generated that they're building office buildings and they've got 10 lobbyists and they're down at the legislature buying meals
every day.
7 days a week.
Yeah.
I mean, and there's a bunch of them. There's a whole mess of them, and they sit and they talk to each other about where we're going to. The hog producers don't want to represent the farmers anymore. They want to represent Seaboard. Well, when you're basically the lobbyist who's supposedly representing you decides to represent or is paid to not represent you, and then that gives cover to the legislatures to basically go against what the farmers in their neighborhood would say about it and say, well, we're doing it for the hog producers, and that's I mean, Farm Bureau and the hog producers have basically disappeared once the corporate farming law came through and allowed corporate ownership of hogs. I mean, they went from a 600 membership, and it used to be every farm had hogs because it was a really profitable thing. And at that time, there were 600 to 800 hog farmers left in the state, and I'm sure there's probably 10 left, and they're headquartered in Chicago. That sort of thing. I mean, that's the way of that world. And there's corn growers you have to be a 3, 4, 5,000 acre. I wrote a deal for the rural paper. I need to go find those. I wrote a thing. It was called The Disappearing Guineas when I first came on the Rural Center, and it was a 3-part series, and it was about I anthropomorphized these guineas, and they kept disappearing, and where were they going? And it turns out there was and they could talk and all that kind of, but it turns out there was a coyote in the neighborhood, and he was a graduate of the state university and in predator studies. He'd done predator studies, and and you had a K-State economist who was just a tool, who was arguing things have to get bigger. You just get out of the business now if you're small. There's the only path forward is for things to, and there was a senator, and I mean, these were all modeled on people I knew personally and was always arguing with. And, at that point, you could still go down to the legislature and you'd be treated civilly by Republicans and Democrats alike. Now you cannot do that. They will hold hearings where they will not allow anybody disagreeing with them to speak, and they'll say submit your testimony, submit as paperwork, but we only have so many hours, and it'll be 100%, lunatics, with conspiracy theories, and they're tell them, yeah, you need to, so it's pretty. State legislature is pretty disgusting, but it used to be at least civil, and there used to be some compromise, and it's gone. It is gone.
There's like cooperation, like it's just no, I'm right. No, I'm right. And like just stuck right
Well,
there.
I don't represent everybody in the state. I represent this 40%, and the rest are not going to get it, because we've figured out how to keep them out. They are not going to get a say in anything. And it's like, well, how long is that going to last? I mean, it's lasted longer than I thought. I continually underestimate how bad it can be. There's always more coming down the pike, but
The dark is darkest right
yeah,
before the dawn.
yeah,
And yeah, every time it gets a little worse, I'm like, maybe this is it. Maybe
yeah.
this is it. Like people gonna wake up and transcend the argument. I don't know. Soon, hopefully.
Anyway, back to the rural center. So then
Yeah.
we started uh, building food policy councils, which were regional groups that would promote local food. And we started doing farmers market trainings. We did a lot of that. We did coupons for expectant and nursing mothers, a WIC coupons available at farmers market. So we got all that through. We got seniors coupons made available at farmers market. And I was working with um, what was it? It wasn't Health and Human Services. Whatever the agency was, you know, both for WIC and for seniors.
Hmm.
I was trying to make life better for back when they tried to make life better for seniors, and I think a lot of people still do, but they were willing to go out, on a limb to do that. The head of, well, at the time he was the head of the administration for Bill Graves. He was willing to try to use money. This is pretty complicated, but money that they gave back to low income people as tax credits. So they paid taxes, but then their income was so low that the state would refund tax credits back. He was willing to argue that that was a state expense, that funding back, and could be matched against other federal dollars to draw down more aid for women, infants, and children, and for seniors and those sorts of things. So there were people like that, in state government. It was like, yeah, let's bring more money, let's bring more things. Now you can't even get to. We'll be the last state to take Medicaid, or the increased funding for Med. It's like it's just incredible to me how
Yeah.
some people are. So we were doing that. We had food policy councils in probably all the major cities, and plus kind of helped start Kansas cities, and we had one in Wichita, Salina, and places like that. And so all that was kind of growing, and we were working with the state to try to make it easier to sell meat and eggs at farmers market, and we tried to get we did get something through that allowed certain non-hazardous foods to be produced at home and brought and sold commercially at farmers markets, as long as as long as you didn't challenge the big companies. If you were small enough that you weren't going to put Dolly Madison out of business, then you were allowed to do those sorts of things. So we did a lot of that kind of stuff. At the same time, we were doing a lot of water quality things at the rural center. Plus, we were doing all these grazing systems groups. We had from that Kellogg grant, we had I don't know, 10, 12, 20 groups who were study groups that were trying to learn sustainable practices and or do marketing together or those sorts of things. So all that was going on. We got fundings from USDA. We got funding from lots of different funding sources from USDA through sustainable ag, and also through water quality, and the federal government was starting to pay attention and come up with funding mechanisms. That whole high tunnels for federal government started buying high tunnels for
What's that?
market hoop houses, that plastic hoop houses that you extend season. So Lynn and I kind of jump started that by buying some. There weren't any in Kansas. If they were used to overwinter pot plants like trees or stuff like that, and none were being used for vegetable production. So Lynn and I bought a couple and started working with Missouri and Kansas and Nebraska was 4-state, I guess, Iowa extension people who were interested in market farming, and we were collecting data from our high tunnels, and that was used in the 4-state vegetable growers conference, and that was used to write an enormous grant through SARE, Sustainable Ag Research and Education. That was a guy named Ted Carey was the extension horticultural specialist here in Kansas, and so we got money for all that, and that turned into a program within USDA that basically bought high tunnels for market farmers around the country. I mean, it became and it still is. I think they still do it, maybe to some extent. It's a pretty big thing. So there were all these kind of deals. I got a grant. I mean, I wrote a grant with KU Bioengineering and the livestock department at K-State that looked at whether antibiotic resistance was being transferred in feedlots because it was being fed as a feed additive and a growth promoter in cattle. I mean, there were truckloads of antibiotics would come and unload, and they pour it into the feed mix, and it was just going through all these livestock, and it was causing antibiotic resistance in livestock, in mammals. And so we were curious as to whether it was going into the water in these big lagoons, and whether it was causing antibiotic resistance in waterborne, I don't know, what do you call them? I forgot. But the shedding of the livestock into those lagoons was causing either waterborne organisms and/or soil organisms to also start being antibiotic resistance. Antibiotics was being used to treat fruit trees against fire blight. I mean, I think it was tetracycline. They would spray orchards with. I mean, there was just no thought that this stuff could be overused and it would lose its effectiveness and and we're going, yeah, it's just going, and then they're going, nah,
It's that same assumption of like it's always going to be there. It's always going to keep being what it is.
So there was the researcher at K-State. She was an Army major in there and a veterinarian. So Army veterinarians back when there were horses. Their mission had evolved to where they were the food safety people for the Army. And you think about how would you destroy an Army easily, and poison them, figure out a way to get into their food system. I mean, it's a really important. She was just great. So she was earning her master's degree, and she was really the first person in that kind of level of the military that I got to know, and I just had so much respect for her. She just was, and she convinced feedlots to let her take samples, to let them sample the effluent in their feedlots to survey what was there, which feedlots don't want you. They bought into it because she was just that convincing. And we had to say, we're not going to publicize this or anything like that. This was going to be research. But
compromise.
We found cholera. We found all kinds of things. We found all kinds of antibiotic resistance, both in soil and waterborne organisms. I mean, to me, it was common sense. Of course, you'd have that. And the response is, we don't want to know.
She put the blindfold back on, and
nobody knows if there's, it was that kind of deal. But so we got that not published, but it became. There's still a treatise out there at K-State, and they told her, K-State told her, if you want a PhD for this instead of a master's, we'll do it. And she said, I'm going back to the Army, and she went back. And
I don't care about your PhD. I'm good.
Wasn't that?
I don't need that.
She needed an advanced degree, but she was just great. So that was, so I write this grant, so I'm administering the grant. Well, I'm being the director of the Rural Center at the same time. It's sort of like, Somebody would say, well, we need to see your timesheets. And I go, I'm not doing a timesheet. I mean, I just stonewalled.
No.
I did 20 some years of stonewalling, that kind of thing. I just wouldn't let them know. And they didn't want to see the timesheet. I mean,
You don't want that.
yeah, they just, yeah, you know,
I just said no.
yeah. Well,
They asked and I said no. Like, wait,
if you
what?
promise to read it, I'll give it to you. That would have been just as effective, I think, because they didn't want to read. Okay, on Thursday, October 7th, he spent 15 minutes. Oh, and here's
Like
another
thousands
15
of lines long. Yeah, here you
minutes.
go. Here's my timesheet.
So I just never did it. And, I had some of my staff members were more conscientious and would ask me to do that. And I'd go, no, I'm not going to do this.
I
So
love
that's,
you're just like, no. I mean, in my mind, I'm like, wait, how do you get away with that? And it seems that's not your question.
well, now we have
I'm just
Donald
not
Trump.
doing it.
Now we have Donald Trump to know how you get away with that. You just
You just keep
don't.
saying no.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, oh, it turns out nobody cares.
How
So,
hard are they really going to push for it is really the question that like there's so many rules out there that look like they're being enforced and then you actually break it and nothing happens. Like
mm,
that's the world we live in today
yeah.
is that there's been a lot brought to light of like just how
Mm,
many rules and laws like it's like an electric fence that's not turned on.
mhm.
And so are you really letting it hold you on this side or like do you just like I'm just not going to do that and you just charge right into wherever you want to go?
That's sort of that way. Yeah. So anyway, there was 25 years of that, and those are samples of some of the projects I did, and
Wow.
I got to know. Basically, I would work. Well, okay, so then this woman who was I mentioned earlier, who just died recently, she um, was a big supporter of Kathleen Sebelius, and when Kathleen Sebelius came in, she started a task force, um, a rural life task force. And so this woman, Sarah, got me to be in charge of that rural life task force. So suddenly that opened the door into state government when you had a Democratic governor. So I could talk to all these agency heads and stuff like
Mm.
that. That opened all the doors to the the WIC programs and the senior service programs and those sorts of things. Prior to that time, I knew Sam Brownback really well, and we had a congenial relationship, and um, we were we non big lobbying group agricultural that and Farmers Union really that he sort of had to kind of pay lip service to, but we would invite him to our annual meeting, that sort of thing, and grill him and stuff like that. So I could go and see him and talk to him, and I got to know him pretty well because he was interested in our vegetable farm, and then he became a senator and all that kind of stuff, and he became a MAGA, basically a pre-MAGA person. He became, where I don't have to pay attention to you because you don't represent these 30% of the people that got me to where I am. He sort of became, he never became uncivil, but he sort of became, I really don't have to pay attention to you. But then I would continue looking for funding. So we started doing renewable energy, wind turbine stuff, small scale wind turbine farms, and trying to get, as wind turbines were coming, we were trying to get, instead of the enormous monopoly owned wind farms, we were trying to get small scale community owned wind farms, so a town could have 3 or 4 turbines or an on farm turbine or that sort of thing. This was prior to solar energy being hot, and so we were working hard to get that permitted in the state. And of course, that's another loss. it, it pretty much has gone the way of gyrene. That's a loss. It hasn't happened in Kansas. It's everywhere else. Are we gone?
It
So
came
so there
back,
were
I
these
think.
things, but okay. So then that led to me coming to the attention of NREL, which is the National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden, Colorado. And they were trying to set up a community wind community wind is another possibility, not just gigantic mega wind farms. And they had a, I don't know, 16 state project. And so I and a woman named Ruth Miller, who was a electrical engineer professor, really interested in this stuff, became the Kansas cohort, in that big group. And so we were putting in small scale wind turbines at schools around the state. And we've been, I don't know, 20 of those in schools and that sort of thing. So I did that for a long time, and we won a couple of awards from NREL for the work we were doing with like junior high schools and things of that nature, and trying to get them into low income communities and low income schools and all that sort of stuff. So that was some of my last years with the Rural Center, was doing that energy stuff while still doing all the local food and food policy councils and all this kind of stuff, and still farming and still being there at the Rural Center. And about 2011, I was getting burned out. It's just like, and
did a lot.
Yeah. And Lynn's magazine was growing and all that kind of stuff. And so about 2011, she had a guy who advertised in her magazine. It was called Seeds from Italy. And she was talking to him because he always did an ad every year. And she said, how it's going. He said, well, I thought I was selling the business. He was 70. And he said, and it fell through, the person couldn't buy it. And she said, what business? She said, so what are you thinking about selling? And they talked, and I happened to be in New Orleans at a conference. I think it was a USDA conference. And he said, well, one of my biggest customers is down there in the French Quarter, Central Market. And so I walked over there and talked to this guy, and it was like a grocery store that had a huge line selling muffaladas, at lunch hour. And over on one wall, they had one rack of these Italian seeds. And there's a lot of Italians in New Orleans, and there's lots of schlock in New Orleans. I don't know if you've spent time. Oh, plastic voodoo heads and Mardi Gras beads, stuff that people buy as souvenirs of New York or of New Orleans.
Okay.
And this guy was right in the middle of all that, and he said, and he was selling $8,000 worth of vegetable seeds from this rack. It was half the size of a refrigerator.
$8,000, like how often? Like
a year.
A year. Okay.
So I was talking to him about it. And he said, yeah. And I said, well, you're in New Orleans in the French Quarter. I go, where do people, how do, there's not even ground to have gardens. And then I said, it was a woman. And I said, who buys this? And she says, I don't know what they do with it. It's New Orleans. Maybe they smoke it.
Anybody's guess.
So anyway, the seeds were beautiful, and the packaging was beautiful. They were truly unique. They were all no hybrids. They were all open pollinated. They were all a family-owned business. Started in 1789. So same family had been in. It was the Franke seeds, and so we started talking to him, and it ended up he had gotten them because he just wanted to see. His grandmother was Italian. He just wanted Italian seeds. And believe me, there's a whole raft of stuff you have to jump through with customs, Homeland Security, and USDA to import seeds. And he had worked his way through that. And so suddenly we're dealing in kilos, euros, and, import regs and all this kind of stuff. And so we took it over. And that was in 2011. So I left the Rural Center, but we were still farming, and Lynn's magazine was going on and all that kind of stuff. And we've often talked about that farm, how that farm, allowed us to start all these micro enterprises. Her magazine was run out of there for the longest time. We started a seed company out there.
Mm-hmm.
We did, we had high tunnels that we turned into a grant. There was all these, it was this place that, hey, let's try that. And we could do that. We could just do.
Yeah.
And so that lasted. I mean, the seed company's still going. Our son runs it. I'm getting more and more decrepit from farming, just injuries. I had a bad hip. I had a bad knee. I couldn't get off the tractor. I couldn't get on the tractor. I couldn't get under the tractor. I couldn't get under the mower. It just was like, it was all turning into pain. I couldn't get on the roof. The roof was falling off. I need to get up on the roof, that kind of stuff. So it just, eventually it was like, I can't keep farming. It's just, at least vegetable farming, because it's just too much physical stuff. And so that was where we jumped, and we bought that, and I resigned the rural center. And so we ran it out of the farm from 2011 to 2017. And now we have a place here in Lawrence, and we sold the farm, and the seed business is fine. It's mostly an internet business, and plus several, probably 20 or 30 retail stores carry racks and stuff like that.
Were those already in place?
Some of them were, but we have new ones too. Yeah.
Yeah.
And some fell off. I mean, pandemic was really hard, on hardware stores. Excuse me. All that
Brick
sort
and
of
mortar.
Yeah, that was really, it was both Lynn's magazine and market farming and the seed business are counter-cyclical. When people get, it means that in times of depression, when people get really worried about where their next meal is coming from, we do better. People buy seeds. People start thinking about, I got to grow my own. I got to learn how to do this. That sort of thing. So we were always, during the worst of times, we were slightly better. I mean, the farming had drought years and wet years and okay years, and but eventually with the high tunnels and stuff like that, we kind of stabled that so that the cycles got better. And when we started farming, you could not buy eggs, you could not buy beef or pork or chicken. You could very few. I mean, we had Alice Waters, the woman who sort of put a local food restaurant idea on the map out in San Francisco. You'll have.
Oh no, that's a different Alice. Okay, I was like, I have an Alice on my list of people I want to interview on this podcast, but different one.
Alice Waters is really, really well known as the chef who made a local food restaurant work. She got on the board of the Land Institute out in Salina, and we did a fundraising event in Lawrence in '94 with her and a guy named Michael Abelman and Wes Jackson as the big three speakers. And we did a big local meal and, all this kind of stuff, and farmers market and chefs training. And she met with women chefs who were interested in, a whole, like a 2-day extravaganza. So it was September, the height of vegetable season around here. Now we know that's not the height. We took her to the farmer's market, and she was going to illustrate how to do how to make a local meal. There was no food at the farmer's market. I mean, nobody was growing. There were a couple of tomatoes and maybe some, and she was going like, what, I can't, there's nothing here that I could make a meal out. There's not enough. Yeah. So '94, it was that bad. And now I think there were like maybe 10 farmers markets in the state, if that. And there were maybe another 20 people doing tailgate, doing a crop of melons and sitting out there on the road and selling them. And now there's, 100 farmers markets, and some of them are running year round. I mean, all this stuff within the last, say from 1990 to now, has happened in Kansas, and we're taking that for granted. Yeah. But there's a lot more local food. I mean, it's just like, you can pretty much eat local food most of the time if you want. So that had happened in I mean, I don't take all the credit for that. There was a lot of people sweating, but but
But
but
individuals showing up and pushing it
oh yeah,
forward. Yeah,
yeah,
caring about it.
or even being told that they could, it's like sort of like, I mean, the K-State would have said then, no, it's a dead end, forget that. Now Farm Bureau, embraces it and acts like they're the big local food. I mean, it's been
Whatever.
been
Dude.
institutionalized. It's really kind of funny to see. So, and
Oh,
that's not to say that big ag didn't get bigger and more concentrated. I mean, that also happened at the same time,
yeah. Yeah.
but
Mm.
you know, Roundup's got a $10 billion lawsuit that they're trying to settle, and all this kind of stuff is.
Hmm.
Some of the other things we got involved in was rice. So there was a company called Ventria Biotech, and they were out in near Sacramento in the rice region, and they were trying to bioengineer a hormone, a lachrymose hormone, a hormone from human tears into rice. So a human production gene manufacturing a hormone. They were trying to engineer a human gene into rice. And they're doing
What?
this. Their thought was because then they were going to make um, sort of bars, medical bar, like a Cliff Bar that a child with severe diarrhea could eat, and that hormone was shown to be effective in slowing diarrhea. So they're willing to put a human gene into one of the, I don't know, 4 or 5 human staples worldwide
Yeah.
in the middle of one of the biggest rice growing regions in the world
Yeah.
in order to make a type of rice that they could use to make a Cliff Bar to give to sell to agencies to give to children when they had diarrhea, as opposed to try to give him clean water. Let's put that same effort into trying to get clean water in all these places. Well, the biogenetically engineered fruits and vegetables were really controversial, as was bovine growth hormone and milk production was another thing that we had in one of our big battles. So there's 2 big battles about that. And anyway, the rice growers in California ran them out and said, we'll never be able to sell our rice around the world ever again if any of this escapes. And it always escapes. It invariably escapes.
Hmm.
So they chased them out. They went to, I think, North or South Carolina, another rice growing region. They got chased out there. They went to, and they're getting big USDA grants every time they do it, and state money. Yeah, we want this biotech industry to come in their state. So then they got chased out of there. They went to Missouri. They got chased out of there. They came to Kansas. There's no rice, we're going to the state where there's no rice grown. So this should all be fine. And the state's going, yes, we're going to be the biotech, capital of the world because we're going to have this, and K-State falls all over himself, and the legislature falls all over itself. So they come to out there, and they put in a couple of rice fields out near Chapman, Kansas. And the rice growers from Missouri come up and say, we just don't want this at all, because they got burned by some biotech rice getting into their fields, and they had something like $700 million. I don't remember the number, but a huge amount of rice got booted from the European Union for biotech contamination. So that was, so you've got these big people fighting with big people over what can happen. So they thought they'd come to Kansas, and Kansas was like, oh, so thrilled. And they came here, and I took them out to see the fields. just to say, they go, where are they? And I said, oh, I'll go show you. So we went out there, and they'd been harvested. And so I'm sitting there with like these 8 or 10 guys from Missouri who are really the rice executives, the executives of the rice industry in Missouri, whatever that was. And we drive out there, and we're sitting there, and they walk right out in the field and start picking up rice. And I'm going, oh shit, this is trespassing. This is theft. This is, and I'm going, I am implicated, and they're in my farm.
You're a rule breaker. We established
Well,
that.
well, the whole thing fell, and it didn't anyway. The rice wouldn't grow very well in Kansas and all that kind of stuff. And so, plus they ran through the money that they got from the state. So then they went to Colorado, and they moved to Colorado and got a big, sure, come on, we welcome the biotech industry, and they quit growing rice entirely. I mean, somebody finally convinced them it's just a bad idea. Why would you risk contaminating one of the human staples of the world to make a stupid ass thing when it's a treatment that could be prevented with better water for people?
Well, it reminded me of what you were saying earlier about like there's a big difference between famine relief and trying to install sustainable agriculture practices that can just feed them give a man a fish or teach the man to fish kind of thing versus like are we gonna give them a medicine for a problem, or are we gonna just solve the problem? Well, depends on who's looking at it. And some people would wonder where's the most money to be made. And
That's exactly right.
that ends up motivating a lot of things, but not everybody. And one thing that I get from your story is that like the money was not what motivated you from the very beginning of like, I would rather be home on the farm with my baby. And you and your wife deciding to be poor just so you could like live the life that you wanted to live. Like,
And now I'm not poor.
exactly. Because truly, I think there is a way to like, you do have to go through that though. Like
Mm-hmm.
the whole like leaving it behind and not being ruled by it.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually it's like it all kind of sorts itself out. Like you find what you enjoy. You find what you can show up to for 20, 30, 40 years,
Exactly.
like your wife's magazine, like this is just already what I'm doing. This is a byproduct of what I'm doing because I want to be doing it. And then other people want to know about it. It starts making money that way. I think that's way more accessible than people will believe, but you do have to walk through the desert, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak, to get there. I feel like I resonate with that as far as like, but I do feel like it corrects at some point.
Well, some of it means, yeah, you're willing to walk away from some security towards something that looks like more fun.
Right? Like,
Yeah,
what are your values? What's most important?
yeah.
Yeah.
But back to the biotech for a little bit. The Catholic Church was really good about um, biotech, and they had several um, sort of famous priests who became sustainability guys. Like liberation theologians only for rural agriculture and family farms and stuff like that. And one of them, Father David, what was his last name? Anyway, he got all the bishops in the country to come together in Wichita to talk about biotech, and they brought in Monsanto and all this kind of stuff. And I remember there was this Monsanto was touting golden rice, so it was a rice that had it was gold colored, so it had vitamin A or D, whichever one it is, and how this was going to eliminate blindness, and it was going to be the high nutrition thing. It was available. I mean, every place that they were going to grow this already had ways to deal with that vitamin. It's just that they didn't have enough food, or they didn't have water, or they didn't have this sort of thing. But Monsanto needed to show at least one thing that benefited the ultimate consumer as opposed to their Roundup sales. I mean, all of their efforts in biotech were, how do we twin this with one of our chemicals that we sell,
Mm-hmm.
and then how do we get farmers so that they have to grow both of those. So we grow the seed, and they basically, because they're so big, they can't cultivate anymore. I mean, it was all all of the biotech was not aimed at making the world a better place. It was, how do we sell more of this? And I remember the lobbyist that was there. I said, well, so what are you doing about the consumer? What are you doing? How are you using these powerful technologies to benefit individuals? And she brings up the golden rice, which was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. It wasn't funded by Monsanto. And she says that, see, that's something that will, everybody will be so much better off. And I said, you don't do that. And she said, well, yeah, but biotech does. And I said, well, what do you do? I mean, what do you have a policy where you're working on things of that nature? And she goes, no, but we sometimes in passing find things that might be useful to the consumers, and we'll pass that. We'll be sure and pass that along. And I'm going, God, the values of this are just totally different. Totally.
Yeah. And it is. I mean, when people's behavior confuses us and it just is like, it doesn't make any sense to me at all. Typically, they are valuing things very differently than we are. And that's why we don't understand what they're doing. But it's like, oh, I get it. You think this is the most important thing. Oh, now your behavior makes total sense. Like, yeah, if I wanted to maximize money, I'd probably do that too. But I don't. I want to maximize this other thing. So I'm doing something very different. So,
Quarterly return to shareholders. That's the only thing
yeah.
The FERC, which is the Regional Electrical Regulatory Agency, that not regulatory, but make sure that there's enough power in the grid to power every region in the country, and that's all screwed up anyway. But it's different regions, and I turn on electricity, it's there. I can't complain about what happens except when it doesn't. But there was back when the whole discussion was about wind turbines and how much wind energy the grid could absorb, and basically the coal guys say it can't absorb anything. We're doing it as a favor. It's totally uneconomical. It's idiotic, and we need no renewable. I mean, as little renewables as possible, because then we have to have backup when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine and all this kind of stuff. Of course, if you have a grid, the wind will be blowing over here and then it'll be blowing over there. I mean,
Balances out. Yeah.
and so they said if it ever got to 20%, we'd be surprised. And so we were working to try to get them to take 20%. Now it's something like 40%. It's like when they were forced to do it, and it's cheaper for them. I mean, it's like we forced them to do something really good for their business model that they totally did not want. They wanted to build the coal plant out in Western Kansas, which would be such a dinosaur. I mean, we did Western Kansas the biggest favor ever, and the grid the biggest favor ever, by stopping that thing. And of course, everybody was reviled, for doing that.
Well,
Anyway,
yeah, they were invested in the past version, and
during one of these discussions about how much wind energy was going in, it was brought up. Well, at that time, the tar sands pipelines were in were trying to go in and all that kind of stuff because the refineries were built on the Gulf Coast and the oil was up there. And so instead of building a new refinery, which those are going to wear out anyway, they were going to pipe it all the way across the country. And it came out in FERC that almost all the wind energy that was going to be on board for the next, I don't know, 8 to 10 years would be needed to heat and push that tar sands oil through the pipeline down to the Gulf. So everything that was going to be built on wind in terms of renewables and wind energy was going to be used to push tar sands, which is it is not the low-lying fruit of fossil fuels. It's like a really expensive one in the wrong place.
Yeah.
And it was like, I mean, I don't look for evil in the world, but just stupidity can amount to evil, I mean, it just can. It's like
Yeah.
you can be stupid enough that it's really evil. It's just like, I don't know.
Well, because it's your point that like, why not just have more wind turbines and not even be digging this shit out of the earth in the first place? Like, basically, like, why are we
Yeah.
even doing this? Like,
Yeah.
because it makes some people money. It makes the powerful ones like they're vested. They like it like this because that's their status quo. And toppling the status quo is like a David and Goliath kind of game that, it takes a big heart to keep showing up and keep doing it. And I like in your story how, there were pieces that carried through just on this episode. Like there were pieces that carried through where for the whole last like 30 years or whatever, you've been pushing this thing like sustainable agriculture, organic farming, market farming, like these kind of themes. But then there were the ideas where like this is just too hard. This is too heavy. I don't have enough support. There's not enough other people into it. It's not key enough. And you like got to figure out like when do you keep pushing and like giving it your energy because it's worth that? And when is it like, the tomato canning and they don't want that? Like that's just not a good idea. It, like had this flaw in it or whatever. Like let it go.
That could come around again, though. I mean, over,
Timing is huge.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's ripeness, you know.
Yeah.
If there's lots of ideas that you can have that are good and right, but they're not going to fly now.
Yeah.
But they will fly, or they're going to fly, when things change. So
Yeah.
it's
Well,
it's. I always describe, what a vector is. If you got something spinning around
yes.
and it leaves that circle at any one point, it's going to go straight.
Hmm.
But anyway, there's vectors all the way around, and once where you are on that circle means your choices are going to be different. You're going to head into a different direction. I'm trying to use physics to say just things are going to be different no matter where you start,
Hmm.
and you're going to and you just and it adjusts every millisecond.
Right.
You know? It's
Now. Yeah.
like the world of Kansas now is different than the world of Kansas in 1990. And
Oh, even
and
2 years
and
ago, probably. Yeah.
and yet you can still find stuff that's very worthwhile doing that pushes us in a right direction. And you're also going to find people who weren't even involved 30 years ago who are going to combat you, or who are going to are invested in something else
Hmm.
that that works against what you're trying to do. It's
Yeah.
just inevitably you're going to have new things to do, and you're going to have new people who don't want you to do it. And whatever you get done is going to lead to new things to do and new people who don't want you to do it. I mean, that's life in a nutshell. It's
Basically. Yeah. Very well said. Yeah.
if if you're trying to change the world anyway, you're trying to change anything. That's if you're
You
not
could,
trying to do
right.
anything, then you just do what you're.
You could float on the status
Yeah.
quo. There's
Yeah.
there's a lot of people that do that and they all have their own reasons.
Mhm.
But yeah, if you want things to be different, then it takes showing up and having a goal. Like, I want this institution to use this one word in one publication this year. Like, this is what I want to have happen, and I'm willing to continue showing up over and over and over. And I feel like, for me, this podcast is one such place that, like, I show up because I want the evidence to be really well known in the world that, like, you can make things different if you'll continue to show up.
Mhm.
If you will do it over and over and over again, you can like with the power in your hands, you can make the world a different place. So like you can either sit there and talk about how much you hate what it is, or you can show up in a specific place in a specific time and try something. It might not be the world's greatest success story. You might do it a couple years and figure out like, oh, that's why that doesn't work. But like you were saying about like even just trying to farm, and then here's the magazine that grew out of like the attempt at farming was to show you how little information was floating around for everybody doing this, and like
Mhm.
bam, there's a pathway coming off your experiment. So you never know what's going to unfold or what's going to pour out of the cup that like you show up to it and you don't know. Finding your wife at the
Mm.
thing that like you didn't know that that's what was waiting there for you. You're just doing the next thing that feels like this is what feels right to me. You know, my values line up with this thing. Let me show up. Let me show up. Let me show up. Showing up. It's like 99.9% of how to change the world. Keep showing up.
Here's one, maybe a good one to end on.
Yes,
There's a
please.
book called 1491, and it's about before the pre-Columbian period, before Columbus came to the U.S. I mean,
Okay.
there were probably Europeans, elsewhere, but basically it looks at the indigenous people that were in the Americas before Europe came.
Hmm.
And there's an expert about one aspect of that book, and he's mentioned in the book, and now I can't think of his name, but it's about biochar in the Amazon basin. How there's evidence that there were a lot more people in the Amazon basin, and that they were used. And Amazonian soils are lateritic; they're iron. So much rain comes through, it just pours through. And the forest can grow, but it's really hard to find soil, topsoil,
Mm.
stuff to make a good garden. So there's this huge areas that are full of charcoal and pottery shards. And they're going, and they've come to the conclusion that people were manufacturing high quality soil in the Amazon to a huge extent. Those are great. It's a great book. There's another one called 1492, which is the year after this. But so biochar, I'd never heard of. It's called terra pretty soils in I think Portuguese or something, and it's ameliorating soils with charcoal, and it really helps things grow. And now you've got so I got really interested from reading that book, and so we got a group together at K State, and some soil scientists and guys who are composting and trying to convince them to
Put some
you know
charcoal in there.
put charcoal and all this kind of
Yeah.
stuff. And
Because
and
you
so
read a book. Like that's just
yeah, so I thought, well, this looks like fun, and
this.
I love to have that charcoal in my in my fields. I mean, and I can do it, and I can do experiments here with that sort of thing, and I did do experiments with it, but it never took off yet. But it's going to take
Give
off.
it, yeah, give it
It
time.
wasn't ripe then,
Yeah.
but
I love
I'm
that word ripe. And like I think about like an incubator or like an egg that needs to, before it's gonna hatch, it's gotta sit there and it's gotta grow into itself. And,
yeah.
or like the butterfly that like you can't, even if the butterfly's pushing against the cocoon, like opening the cocoon for the butterfly, it's not helpful. It needs to be in there long enough so that its wings can push the cocoon open. That's how you know they're strong enough that the butterfly can fly. So
Mhm.
like there's a timing of when something is able to like push itself out of its chrysalis and like make its debut, you know? And it's not really our business to know why things take the time they take, you know?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. You just keep showing up.
Something may have to happen, or the right person may have to come along, or a
Exactly.
terrible event or a wonderful event. Either some of
Yeah.
those things make
Yeah.
it change.
Well, because again, you don't even know what the real point is. Like, I think about the story that you told me about the army veterinarian. I'm going to remember that for the rest of my life just because of the way you lit up about who she was and how she was. And you had so much respect for her. And it's like, was the point the project itself, or was the point to just meet a cool person and get to work with them and collaborate? And yeah, I mean, there's so many gifts that we can receive and we can appreciate. And even if the outcome, I want to make this thing happen and it totally didn't work, you probably still had a cool experience along the way, you know?
So here's the coda, the end. So in 2011, we bought the seed company, and I basically stepped aside in about 2018 or so, 2019. And Lynn still does some stuff in it, but all of a sudden, we're going to Europe and hanging out with Italians and Romanians and stuff, and so we've had. I mean, I'd been to Europe several times before, but suddenly we have these friends and colleagues in Italy. And so the last 10 years of our life has really been enriched in that way by by going through another door.
Yeah.
It's really kind of funny.
Yeah.
So there's stuff that comes along with whatever you do that
Yeah.
is if you just it's not so much I've always done every time that I've done stuff I really wanted to do, but it comes down to, is can I tolerate doing this? Does this look like this is something that won't just deaden me to the world, but will, enrich my life somehow? That's sort of how we've found our pathway.
Yeah. Well,
And
and I can see that from the very first episode, of like your measuring stick of how fun is this to me? How alive do I feel? How excited do I feel about what I'm doing? And I mean, even as early as law school, like, or even before that, of just wanting to be worldly, like wanting to go
Mhm.
and try something and being willing to take that risk. And I mean, it also sounds like you took several risks throughout your story of places where you took a leap of like, I have no idea what's over there, but I'm gonna go,
Well,
and
and what that tells me is that the risks weren't that great. I weren't so
it didn't
great.
feel like a risk.
Well, there that I had to fear, oh, I'll never have food in my mouth again. I mean, it's not
What's
the way.
really at risk here? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's sort of like
Oh, wow.
comfort may be at risk, or uh, some ease of doing something may be at risk. But
Yeah. Dude, put your comfort zone at risk
yeah,
every single time. Push yourself out of it every single time. Like the growth and the blessings, the gifts that come along
mhm,
with it, like the
mhm,
random people that you meet through the business that you didn't know you were going to buy. Like, yeah, just keep showing up. I think
mhm.
that's a great place to leave it.
Yeah.
Dan, thank you so much for indulging us in the 6 hour version of your life story. I have loved this for real. I feel like this one, especially, like I connected so many dots and so many ideas around like just the ideas that you shared here. So, like, not that I want to open a tomato processing cooperative, but I was like, oh, that's just like what I want to do over here. Maybe I could. You stirred me up. So, thank you for that. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well,
It
this has
was
been a lot of fun.
yeah, I wonder just what was it like for you to recount your story in this kind of a deep dive kind of way?
Well, some of it I've been writing about, but I haven't really gotten to the parts since leaving Africa yet. I mean, a
Yeah,
few little things. So it was. I mean, it's a good to dredge up some of those things, and it's been the hardest because I've really not left all this behind. It's still here. The Africa stuff was that's back there, but
right.
this stuff is there's some continuity here that has made it hard for me to kind of isolate it into a series of
Yeah.
events or stories, I guess. So
That's
yeah,
what
it was kind of fun. And as we were talking, I mean, you saw me just recollect stuff,
right.
this happened. Oh yeah, that happened. I mean,
Yeah.
that was
And
good.
this and this and
There's a
this. So
lot of us.
it's amazing how, I find that with a lot of people that like when you start telling your own story, you lived it and you have this assumption that like you know exactly what's in there. But when you start pulling it up and out and having to tell the story out loud, like you find all these little pieces that it's like, wow, I haven't even thought about that in 20 years or whatever it is.
Or if it includes other people, and you say, you remember that time? They go, no, and that they just
Yeah.
there's a blank spot there. They just don't know, and it's
Yeah.
like I remember it, and they probably remember things that I don't remember, but it's just kind
Right.
of funny how
Yeah.
much goes away. So
Yeah. And then you pull it back and yeah. I also will just say one more time that like there's several links in the description for Dan's Substack, some different examples of the articles. It's totally
mhm.
free. He's got a bunch of stuff. Do you know how many articles you have on there these days?
60, 80, I don't know, something like
I
that.
was gonna say like they come through pretty
Well,
frequently,
some
put new ones too.
of them are really long. I mean, there's a couple of them that were my childhood on the farm and my education, and those are, I don't know, not book length, but they're
They're a
30,
chapter. for
Yeah, they're
sure. Yeah.
28,000 words. That's, a book is like 60.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's they're there, they're
Yeah. Well, and do you think like when you write these, is it for you or is it for the reader or like,
I think I enjoy recalling them, and I revise them all the time too because I'll remember other things. But
oh yeah.
I generally choose stuff that I think people will be amused by or frightened by, or just or
You're
what the
like,
hell. I can't believe, I mean, and there's a lot of that. Everybody's life has that stuff, and most people
totally.
don't realize they should have been going, "What the hell was that?" They just kind of go home and turn on the TV afterwards. It's like
Yeah.
there's stuff that are remarkable in everybody's life.
Yeah, definitely. If we're willing to mine it, if we're willing
Mhm,
to look at what's there,
mhm,
appreciate what we have instead of
mhm.
focusing so much on maybe what's missing or what's not quite what we want it to be yet.
Oh,
Um,
dude, TikTok me. Give me a TikTok quick.
hurry up, numb it back out. Dude, I feel the pain of the people who numb themselves out. Like I've had my moments where yeah, like I don't want to think about my own life. It hurts too much to do that. And so here, let me distract myself. And I'm grateful that these days, most of the time, that's not where I'm at. And I feel like I'm living proof that you can go from one to the other. You can walk yourself right on over there.
You have a
Um,
lot of chapters.
huh?
You have a lot of chapters, and you don't know what most of them are yet.
I know it takes looking inside of them and going back through and not operating on the assumption that like I lived it. I know what it was. It's like tell the story of it. I
Mhm.
guarantee you'll learn something. So, yeah, I love this podcast. I love getting to hear people's stories and getting to pretty consistently they talk about how like wow like I haven't reflected this much on my life or this chapter of my life in years or decades, and so that was really cool to get to remember what was there and get to remember the people that were there and all the things. So yes, thank you so much, Dan, for indulging us. Thank you so much to anyone who's listening. Take a second, like the video, leave a comment, tell us what your favorite part of Dan's story was. Coming up soon here in a couple days on the channel, if you're catching this when I'm releasing it, there will also be an all-in-one where you can watch from start to finish. Spend a whole day getting to know Dan's story.
Well,
Put
do
it on for a road trip. Do whatever you got to do there. But yeah, there was a lot in there about like following the common thread of living by your values. And I feel like that's even a common thread through my grocery adventure archive, like through all the guests, is that these are people, the people who are making an impact, they're doing something that matters to them. They're doing it because they care. They're doing it because like they want to see something different in the world and they're willing to put their time into it. And when you look at it like that, really making an impact is like the most simple thing that there ever could be, unless of course you don't know what you care about. And then it can be kind of a question mark. And yeah, to care, you kind of got to pay attention to your point. Like you got to take issue with some things and maybe get mad about some things and then do something about it.
or is there anything that's substantive that interests you at all?
Yeah.
And if there is, that's what you should be
Yeah.
looking at. And
I
then,
heard a quote that just reminded me of that's like there's a lot of talk out there about like finding your passion
mhm,
and how that can be kind of like illusory for people. Like I
I
don't know.
agree. Yeah.
And Elizabeth Gilbert, the writer who wrote Eat, Pray, Love and many other books, she says like instead of looking for passion, look for interest.
Mhm.
What are you interested in? What is like pulling at your focus and your attention? And you can pay attention to it because I'm interested in this, right? Like that's different for everybody, but your impact, your purpose, like that's kind of what did she say? That's like passion's meek younger cousin is interest. Like it will grow into passion if you'll indulge your
Yeah.
interests. So I love that practical tip to cherry on top. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, that's it for this time. We're going to call it a day on this episode of My Grocery Adventure. We'll be back with another one. You guys, this train ain't running out of steam anytime soon. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Dan, for being here. Until next time, everybody take really good care of themselves. Hopefully, dig into your interest a little bit, maybe dig into your own story a little bit. And we'll see you next time. Okay. Bye.